Good evening, everyone. I am Rabbi Michael Klayman of the Lake Success Jewish Center, one of the partnering communities for tonight's Yom HaShoah commemoration. In 2005, Elie Wiesel addressed the United Nations on the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. During that address, he spoke about bearing witness for the sake of our children. It is not too late for today's children. It is for their sake alone that we bear witness. It is for their sake that we are duty-bound to denounce anti-Semitism, racism, and religious or ethnic hatred. We must be engaged. We must reject indifference as an option. Tonight, we join together to be engaged, to bear witness, to reject indifference. We do so for us, for our children, and for all future children. I want to acknowledge all partnering communities, Temple Anshe Chesed and the Jewish Community Council of Erie, Pennsylvania, represented by Rabbi Rob Murray, the Merrick Jewish Center, Rabbi Charles Klein, the Reformed Temple of Forest Hills, Rabbi Mark Kaiserman, and Temple Tikva of New Hyde Park, Rabbi Randy Scheinberg. Rabbi Scheinberg.
Thank you, Rabbi Klayman, and thank you from the bottom of my heart to all of you who have come here tonight to, as Rabbi Klayman said, to engage, to remember, to bear witness, and to commit to making a better world. Yizkor, remember, is a Jewish commandment. We are commanded, it is our imperative to regularly recall those who are no longer living. Generally, this imperative refers to our obligation to our own families, our own loved ones who have died. But tonight, on this sacred occasion, we remember together our collective Jewish family. We widen our circle of caring and compassion, and yes, pain and sorrow, to encompass not just our own dead, but also the millions of Jewish souls who perished during the horrors of the Shoah, of the Holocaust. Elie Wiesel once said, "To forget constitutes a crime against memory. Whoever forgets becomes the executioner's accomplice." So tonight, we remember. Proverbs teaches us, Ner Adonai Nishmat Adam, God's very light is the human soul. So tonight, we kindle lights, 6 candles, to remember the 6 million Jews who perished, young and old, heroes and martyrs, children, parents, lovers, best friends, those who shed tears, those who put on brave faces, fighters, and those who surrendered hope, each of them a unique manifestation of the divine, each a light in our firmament. Let each of their souls light the way. On this most solemn of occasions, we open our hearts and minds and souls to each of them. And God, tonight, as we remember those 6 million and the 11 million total who perished, and the indifference and the evil, we ask you to soothe our souls, to amplify our memories, and to strengthen our resolve to fight hatred and injustice in all its guises. I'm now going to call upon each of my colleagues to take their turn to kindle one of the 6 lights. We begin first with Rabbi Murray.
When I was 13, I became bar mitzvah. When he was 13, he became bar mitzvah. When I was 13, my teachers taught me to put tefillin on my arm. When he was 13, His teachers taught him to throw a hand grenade with his arm. When I was 13, I studied the pathways of the Bible and roadways of the Talmud. When he was 13, he studied the canals of Warsaw and the sewers of the ghetto. At my bar mitzvah, I took an oath to live as a Jew. At his bar mitzvah, he took an oath to die as a Jew. At my bar mitzvah, I blessed God. At his bar mitzvah, he questioned God. At my bar mitzvah, I lifted my voice and sang. At his bar mitzvah, he lifted his fist and fought. At my bar mitzvah, I read from the scroll of Torah. At his bar mitzvah, he wrote a scroll of fire. At my bar mitzvah, I wore a new talit over a new suit. At his bar mitzvah, he wore a rifle and bullets over a suit of rags. At my bar mitzvah, I started my road of life. At his bar mitzvah, he began his road to martyrdom. At my bar mitzvah, family and friends came to say L'chaim. At his bar mitzvah, Rabbi Akiva and Trumpeldor, Chana and her 7 sons came to escort him to heaven. At my bar mitzvah, they praised my voice, my song, my melody. At his bar mitzvah, they praised his strength, his courage, his fearlessness. When I was 13, I was called up to the Torah. I went to the Bima. When he was 13, his body went up in smoke. His soul rose to God. When I was 13, I became bar mitzvah and lived. When he was 13, he became bar mitzvah and lives now within each of us as we light this first candle.
Turn next to candle number 2, which will be lit by Rabbi Klein.
In a well-known conversation, Simon Wiesenthal of blessed memory said this to another Jew: "You're a religious man. You believe in God and life after death. I also believe. I believe that when we come to the other world and meet the millions of Jews who have died in the camps, and they will ask of us, 'What have you done?' There will be many answers. You will say, 'I became a jeweler.' Another will say, 'I built houses.' But I will say, 'I didn't forget you.' In memory of all of those who we will never forget, we light this second candle.
Invite Rabbi Kaiserman to kindle candle number 3.
This was found on a wall in a cave in Cologne where Jews had been hiding. I believe in the sun, though it is late in rising. I believe in love, though it is absent. I believe in God, though God is silent. And still we believe.
We turn next to Rabbi Klayman to kindle candle number 4.
Words from Abba Kovner, resistance fighter and celebrated Israeli author. The living shall remember their dead, for they are forever before us. Look, their eyes dart round and about, allowing us no peace until our lives become worthy of their memory.
candle number 5, I share these words of an anonymous youth in Terezin, who said, "We gave a lot of thought to how we could not only be of assistance to the old people, but also to bring them some joy. We looked through the card index and found the birthdays of all of the people who were alone. And on these days, we would bring them presents they had made or received themselves. A few flowers, a plated loaf of bread, or cake they had saved from their rations. We sang songs for them, and we arranged, if possible, a small party. The old people who were unable to believe that kindness still existed in the world wept. When we had to leave them, we would hear their calls from the beds packed close to each other. Come back again soon." I light this 5th candle for all of the kindness displayed in the most horrible of conditions, bringing us continued faith in humanity. And for the 6th and final candle we will kindle together this evening, I turn to all of you. One of the great gifts of us being together is the gift of community. It reminds us that Am Yisrael Chai, that the people of Israel continues to live, and that as we reach out to each other, as we continue to strengthen our resolve to live out our values, to make the world a better place and to fight hatred, then there is hope. So I'm going to ask any of you now, of the 179 or so of us gathered, who have brought a candle with you to this gathering, to take it up and lift it. And perhaps all of us can put ourselves on gallery mode now so that we can see one another's candles and feel the brightness of the hope that we now kindle together. Let us all kindle candles now for this 6th and final candle, in memory, in commitment, and in hope. Ner Adonai Nishmat Adam. May the lights we have kindled remind us always to remember, to witness, to never forget, and to carry on with strength and conviction. Amen.
The 23rd song, 23rd Psalm, a Psalm of David. Adonai roi lo echsar, vino teshayar bitzeni, al me benuchot, yelach aleini. Nafshi yishovev, yishovev, yancheni b'maglei tzedek, yancheni b'maglei tzedek, leman shemo. Shulchan Getzorirai Disham Tavar Shemen Roshi Kosi Revaya Achtun v'chesed yirtifuni kol yemei chayai, kol yemei chayai. Eshavti bevit Adonai leorech yamim. Adonai roi lo echsar. Adonai roi lo echsar.
Psalm 23 has many translations, some of them today using ones that the wording is a little more connecting for our view of God and using gender-sensitive language. But just for tonight, we're going to use the translation that might have been used 70 years ago by people saying it in English. And I invite you to say it along in your own homes with me. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He guideth me in straight paths for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou hast anointed my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
May God remember the souls of the martyrs of our people who gave their lives for the sanctification of God's name, and the men, women, and children who were slaughtered in the Holocaust. In their memory, we pray, may our lives reflect a measure of their bravery, dedication, and purity of soul. May their souls be bound up in the bond of life. May they be remembered with honor, and may they rest in peace at your right hand forever. Amen. The El Maleh Memorial Prayer.
Hail, Molech Hamim, Shochein Ameromim, Hametzei Menucha Nechona, Tachas Kanefei Ashechina. B'malos Kedoshim Mitahorim Kizoar Arakia maziri. Es enishemot, shishon yom, achinu v'achotzeinu, shenhargo, shenhargo, al Kidosh Hashem. Allah, Rachamim, Yastireim, b'seisei kinofo leolamim, Bitzeror achayim, es nicht mose. Adonai, unachatam, v'yanuchu b'shalom, al mishkivo seyem. V'nomar, v'nomar Amen.
We conclude this evening's ritual portion of our program with the Partisaner Lied, a Yiddish song considered one of the chief anthems of Holocaust survivors and is sung in memorial services around the world. Sag nicht kein Mal, als du gehst dem letzten Weg. Chashimlen bleiene, verstehen bleie Tag. Kommen wird noch unser Reus gebenkte Shoah. Es wird erpeugt an unser Trott, wir seinen da. Kommen wird noch unser Reus gebenkte Shoah. Es wird erpeugt an unser Trott, wir seinen da. You must not say that you now walk the final way, because the darkened heavens hide the blue of day. The time we've longed for will at last draw near, and our steps as drums will sound that we are here. The time we've longed for will at last draw near, and our steps as drums will sound that we are here.
Thank you, colleagues, and thank you everyone for being with us this evening. We are fortunate, incredibly fortunate, to have with us for our Yom HaShoah commemoration, Dr. Michael Berenbaum, a renowned scholar, teacher, lecturer. He has dedicated his life to making certain that the Shoah will never be forgotten and that its denial will not go unanswered. Those who study the Holocaust and those who, like all of you on the Zoom this evening, who are dedicated, heart and soul, to ensuring that the 6 million those who perished in the Shoah will not be forgotten, will know Dr. Berenbaum from his writings, from some of the Holocaust films that we have seen over the years, and some museum exhibits we may have visited. He co-produced One survivor remembers the Gerda Weissman Klein story, which was recognized with an Academy Award, an Emmy Award, and a Cable Ace Award. He was the historical consultant on the Shoah Foundation's documentary, The Last Days, which won an Academy Award for Best Feature-Length Documentary in 1998. And a recent film, The Call to Remember, won an Emmy Award, his second, and he has worked on films for the BBC, PBS, and HBO over the last 2 years. He was project director of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and has participated and led the development of museums in many other places in America and other parts of the world. Many of us who were fortunate enough to have visited the exhibit Auschwitz not long ago, not far away at the Museum of the Jewish Heritage in New York City, that exhibit was developed by Dr. Berenbaum and a team of experts on the history of Holocaust and Holocaust education. He is director of the Siggy Zirin Institute, exploring the ethical and religious implications of the Holocaust, and professor of Jewish studies at the American Jewish University in Los Angeles. Yesterday, in an aside, Dr. Berenbaum shared with us that he grew up in Kew Gardens, Queens, a community of German Jews who managed to leave Germany in the late 30s. There, he offered us Americanization for young people his age, included and really required learning about baseball. Baseball became the key to American life. And so, as he said to us yesterday in a light aside, he and those in his community never forgave Walter O'Malley for moving the Dodgers from Brooklyn to Los Angeles. But tonight, our hearts and minds are focused on the enormous, incomprehensible, painful tragedy of the Shoah. And we are focused as well on the dramatic rise in anti-Semitism that we are seeing in all parts of our world. We are grateful, we are blessed to have with us this evening Dr. Michael Berenbaum to speak with us and to us about both. And now I call upon Dr. Berenbaum.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Klein, for a gracious introduction. Let me say that being back with you brings me back to my youth and brings me to very familiar places. I've been to each and every one of your communities, and one of the unique elements of this era of COVID is that we're brought together by Zoom and we're joined together by Zoom. What we might have done separately, we're doing together. I've been given an unenviable task, which is to unite two things. One is remembrance of the past, and the other is a critical assessment, critical in the double sense of the word, meaning a very important assessment, and also looking at it with a bit of criticism. Critical assessment of where we are at this moment in the struggle for against anti-Semitism. Let me begin with a very peculiar statement. I have a dream to be irrelevant. And that is that I study evil. And when we created the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the ideal conclusion would have been to say, this is how 20th century humanity behaved one toward another. We could not do that. We could not deal with the world that way. We could not behave toward each other in that way. We have learned. And when we said in those days, never again, it was a call to action, and also the idea, a dream, that we would never again have to face such a cataclysm. I'm going to argue with you a little bit later, or argue for you and with you a little bit later, that there's a danger in seeing everything as a continuity of the Shoah. And that is that we obscure, when we do that, what is distinct about our age and our particular dimension of hatred. But let me go back before we do that and pay homage both to the victims of the Shoah, to those who were killed in the Shoah, and also to the victims of the Shoah who lived, meaning the survivors. We are at a very particular moment in time. We are in the last moment of the transformation from living memory to historical memory. And that is that we are the last of the generation to live in the presence of survivors. And we now live at a not insignificant distance from the event of 75 years, which allows us to look back. Let's take a look at what the great achievement of this generation has been, of the generation of survivors. Survivors who are with us today, who were teenagers, are now in their 90s. And the last survivors will be children's survivors, whose experiences was all too real, whose fears were all too real, yet whose recollections are often pre-verbal images and feelings, with only at a distance they were able to transmit into words. Perhaps it's at this moment that we can reflect on the legacy of survivors, even now when they are with us, and understand what they have to contribute to the Jewish future and to the human future. During the war and the immediate aftermath of the war, survivors did what was most essential, and that is they survived. They endured conditions that thankfully we survivors will never know. And I can only give you one example from a conversation we had yesterday with a group of youngsters who met with a woman who survived for 2.25 years in a barn, in the upper deck of a barn, living there without any contact with human beings except for the brief moments in which somebody left food for her and then ran back into the house for fear that they might be discovered. Their question to her was, what did you do with Zoom? And what was your connection to the internet? And it's only when they understood that that was a world in which they were radically alone, and which every time somebody knocked or somebody walked by, you were in danger, they began to understand what the conditions were and precisely what they faced. We survivors, thankfully, will never know that. And the moment of liberation for survivors was bittersweet. It's not a triumphant story. It's not the story of going from oppression to freedom, the great Passover story. It's a very different story because the moment they were no longer enslaved, they look back and they ask the question, who's left? Where do I find somebody? Who do I know? Where do I go? What do I do? And they struggled to build a future while coming to terms with building a past. Thankfully, most of them chose to survive as Jews. An unknown number of survivors concluded that being Jewish was the third rail of human experience. I taught for many years with Madeleine Albright, who was the Secretary of State. And I taught with Madeleine Albright, jokingly, I would say I taught with Madeleine Albright before she was Madeleine Albright, when she was a colleague of mine at Georgetown. She described her parents as social democrats and Czechoslovakian nationalists. When I heard that, I said to myself, you mean Jews? I didn't say it to her. Because social democrats, there were multiple communities that were committed to social democracy, but only very few were committed to Czechoslovakian nationalism. There were Czech nationalists and Slovakian nationalists. And I was one of the very few who believed Madeleine Albright when she said she didn't know her grandparents were Jewish, because being Jewish for her family was the third rail of human experience. Get away from it as far as you can get. And if you go to Poland today, or last year when you could go to Poland, and you walk into the Jewish Community Center in Krakow, you see walking into that center every day or two, people who on the deathbed of their grandparents are told a secret. And the secret is, you're Jewish. And then they walk into the Jewish Community Center trying to find out, what does that mean and what do I do with that information? Travel to any country in Eastern Europe and you'll see these people who have only now learned what the secret was of their past. And there's a sadness, but also an opportunity when we grapple with them. Many more survivors doubled down on Jewish life. They did something absolutely incredible, which is they married, they gave birth to children, and then they did something even more remarkable, which we'll speak about in a moment. Marrying, they married very often because they were alone. And in the words of one proposal better of a man to a woman, I'm alone, you're alone, let's be alone together. But then they did something very daring, which is that they gave birth to life. And the most remarkable historical phenomenon in Europe is that in the displaced persons camps, you had the largest number of childbirths in all of Europe. The greatest range of fertility took place within the displaced persons camp in all of Europe, meaning survivors responded in an incredible way. They responded to death by recreating life. And as we see, they recreated life by recreating Jewish life. A story. There was a mole in Boston by the name of Rabbi Arnold Weider of blessed memory, who died recently. New Yorkers are not going to like that. He had a nickname in Boston because he was a mole, and Jews always feel a little bit uncomfortable and a little bit tension on a circumcision. So they called him, with no apologies to Joe DiMaggio, they called him the Yankee Clipper. I interviewed Rabbi Weider, whom I knew and whom I studied with, and I asked him, where did you learn to be a mole? And he said, I learned to be a mole in Bergen-Belsen from my father. And then I listened very carefully and I understood I had an incredible story here. I said, what do you mean you learned to be a mole in Bergen-Belsen from your father? He said, well, we circumcised little boys who were born. And we also circumcised those Jewish boys who didn't get a Brit Milah during the period of time when it was too dangerous or impossible. And I scratched my head and I said, for 6 years, if a Jewish male was asked to lower their trousers, they were sentenced to death. And on the 7th year, these Jews, before they knew where they would live, what the world would be like, whether Nazis were coming back to power, on the 7th year, they made an indelible sign of the covenant on their sons, forever transforming them, deciding in essence that no matter what the future would bring, no matter what it would look like, it would be a Jewish future. They also, in an incredible way, created in the displaced persons camp a political movement which said we want to go to Palestine, the name for pre-state Israel, and we want a Jewish homeland. And in one sense, something very great happened in the moments in the aftermath, which is that they essentially decided to create a future, but a deeply Jewish future in which Jews would what? Would have a place to go and would stand out. Some survivors returned to faith. In the United States, they rejuvenated Hasidism and Orthodoxy in the land of freedom. Their final statement about Jewish history was about life, not about death, no matter how pervasive the death. Some survivors looked back immediately. Other survivors waited until that world was more distant, until their new life was more secure. But once they wrestled with the pain and the grief, some survivors found their calling, dare we say, the reason why they survived, by bearing witness. And bearing witness conferred a sense of meaning. They responded intuitively survival in the way in which the biblical Israelites remembered the Exodus. We remember the Exodus, remember the anguish and the evil to deepen conscience, to enlarge memory, to broaden responsibility. When we remember the Exodus, it's the reason we have the Sabbath. It's the reason we have to treat the widow and the orphan, the stranger, and those who are unfortunate with dignity. That's what the ancient Israelites did when they responded to slavery and the Exodus. And that's why the greatest reason given for our moral commandments is because we were once slaves in Egypt. And thus survivors have responded to the Shoah. We Jews took the story of the Exodus and made it from a particular story which retains its particularity. And 2 weeks ago, we all celebrated the Passover, and we sat around the table and retold that story. We made it into a universal story, so every person seeking freedom in the Western world, and dare I say, in almost all of the world, understands what Pharaoh in Egypt is like, understands what Moses is like, understands what it is to cross the sea, and what it is to sojourn into the desert before we come to a promised land. And survivors have looked back on mass murder and genocide to plead against indifference, again, and against inaction. They've pleaded for compassion, for decency, and for respect, not only for the Jewish people, but for all people. They have done something profoundly Jewish, which is victimization was transformed into witness, and dehumanization became a plea to deepen our own humanity. We are the non-witnesses who have lived in the presence of witnesses. A privilege, I dare say, that the next generation cannot have. And the easiest way to say that is to say that today's children will not have children and grandchildren who have lived in the presence of survivors, but we have. What we have learned and what we have read can be transformed into action to rebuild and rebuild the Jewish people, to better the world, to prevent genocide, to alleviate its suffering, and to heal its victims. Tonight, as we join with the memory of those who died, in fact, I don't never use the word perished, I use those who were murdered, because perish is the way in which normal death takes place. This was annihilation, this was murder. As we go with the memory of those who were murdered, we understand that that world cannot become our world, that what led to that world cannot become a world that we tolerate, that we accept. And we understand that that's a responsibility that we all bear. And it's a responsibility that we have to transmit, because even though we have lived in the presence of witnesses and we are not witnesses, we have the responsibility to be witnesses to the witnesses and to presume and to assume their moral task. Having spoken of the past, let me turn to the present. And let me not do this as a speech, but more as a conversation, and invite you also to disagree with me where you find me a bit in a different way, ask questions, provoke, and let's hold it as a comfortable conversation with people who are struggling with the issue of anti-Semitism as we're experiencing it in our world. I'm going to show you an image because I want you to see the image. It's an image that became that's deeply and profoundly offensive. And when you hear who had the image, you're going to be even more offended by it. But I don't do it to offend, I do it to inform and to speak. So with your permission, I'm going to share the screen, and I want you to see what I'm speaking about. The Holocaust in our world has become what I call the negative absolute. And the negative absolute means that we don't know what's good. We live in a world of relativism where values are frightening. We live in a world in which there are alternate facts and alternate truths. But the Holocaust becomes an instrument. We all are almost all in agreement that it becomes the negative absolute, meaning that's evil. And here what you have is you have the transformation of Auschwitz and the transformation of the great sign, Arbeit macht frei, work liberates, the great lie into the lie what vaccines are safe and it's a path to freedom, which should again offend us, but it tells us something very important. It tells us that in a very deep way, we now are living in the post-denial phase of the Holocaust, and the greatest danger to the memory of the Holocaust is trivialization, vulgarization, falsification, minimization, vulgarization. And the greatest of all danger now becomes the idea that people don't deny the Holocaust, but some people are saying it was not enough, unsuccessful. You have somebody parades on January 6th with a t-shirt, with a shirt that says what? Auschwitz staff. And the rumor was that somebody else wore a shirt which said 6MWE, which is a slogan on the internet, 6 million wasn't enough. Ironically, the man who drew that cartoon was the brother of the candidate for the Labour Party in England for Prime Minister, and Jeremy Corbyn's brother. And one of the great pieces of good news in the battle against anti-Semitism was that Corbyn failed, that England avoided that catastrophe, and something else happened. Let me talk about American anti-Semitism because that's on our mind and the like. Let me begin with a piece of good news and then talk about the bad news. If you look at the Pew survey, you see something very remarkable. Judaism is the most admired religion in America. How do we interpret that? More people admire Judaism than any other religion. One of the ways of interpreting it is to say that Judaism is the least unadmired religion in America. And by that I mean the Roman Catholic Church, you understand, has a battle between the pews and the pulpit. The scandal that's dividing the church with regard to sexual abuse is one dimension of it. You also have a conservative clergy battling liberal tendencies within the church, even battling the Pope, who is supposedly the leader of the church. And consequently, Catholicism has problems and credibility problems. Protestantism also is divided between evangelical and mainstream. And evangelical is divided by generation and by politics, because the three issues are dividing evangelicals, young against old. One of the issues is homosexuality. My kids believe there is very little difference between someone who is gay and someone who is left-handed, and that's true of their entire generation. It's divided over the issue of environment, with the younger generation committing to building a more environmental friendly future. And it's divided over a third issue, which is how much it should be involved in politics because of the marriage between the Republican right and the evangelical community of the older sense of leadership. So Protestantism has its issues, and Muslims are distrusted because of all of the years of issues with regard to terrorism. And nobody understands Eastern religions. Consequently, Judaism is literally the most admired religion in America. Why then is anti-Semitism on the increase? And let me suggest 4 reasons which make this anti-Semitism different than my parents' generation, and what I would say not your father's anti-Semitism. The first is those of us of a certain age grew up in a time where if you were anti-Semitic, you didn't dare express your anti-Semitism because it was associated with the Holocaust and Nazism. And consequently, even if you were, there were more percentage, a larger percentage of the population was anti-Semitic in the 50s and 60s and 70s than were today. But the anti-Semites did not express their hatred, did not manifest their hatred in the same way in which racists were tamed for a while from expressing their hatred. The second element is that anti-Semitism now has a megaphone. And the megaphone of anti-Semitism is the internet. And anti-Semitism can no longer be quarantined because it has achieved a great sense of community with the social networks. And finally, and the most important element involved in the increase in anti-Semitism is anti-Semitic increase does not occur alone. Anti-Semitism's increase occurs in the context in which society is unstable and hatred is freely and unapologetically expressed. So the bad news is equal to the good news, which is that Jews are not the only target. We are not the primary target, but we are clearly a target, along with a whole range of other segments of the population who are resented for a variety of reasons. And there is no restraint or little restraint on the expression of anti-Semitism. And furthermore, not only is there no restraint on the expression of anti-Semitism, but there is a social support system for that anti-Semitism. And our society is going through 4 or 5 simultaneous crises at the same time. I don't have to tell anyone we are going through a health crisis. The good news is that the vaccine, God willing, may alleviate some of the health crisis in a dramatic way, but there's been a years-long damage of social isolation that will take a considerable time to overcome. The second crisis we have is an economic crisis, which is a reflection of the health crisis. The third crisis we have is a social justice crisis, a dramatic increase of inequality and the dramatic increase of animus and hatred expressed in society. A large segment of the population feels that there is equally an ecological problem, and living in California, and as well as the people who live in the southeast of the United States, where we have the combination of earthquakes and fires and drought, we can't deny that our future is linked to a certain type of ecological crisis. And the other thing that we have in our society right now is a crisis of leadership and polarization. And I don't have to tell you that the understanding of a polarized society, you know, people ask me now to speak on something I never had to speak about, which is people ask me today, not only in the United States, but in other places in the world, to speak about the collapse of the Weimar Republic. How is it that democratic society became authoritarian and ultimately totalitarian? And I speak of polarization and dysfunctionality, and I speak of the collapse of the center. And everybody nods their head and says, oh my God, that sounds familiar. So anti-Semitism in the United States is a reflection of the radical increase in the permissibility of the expression of hatred, in the sense of crises and dislocation, in the sense also of what we have with conspiracy theories. And we will have conspiracy theories develop out of the conspiracy theories will also develop out of a COVID. And you know that the head of Pfizer is a Greek Jew whose parents were sent to Auschwitz and his grandparents were killed at Auschwitz. And you're going to hear the statement made in the future that the Jews brought the pandemic in order that they profit from its cure. And all of that conspiracy theory, which is only going to radically increase in the world today. If I haven't depressed you enough, let me take you for a tour of the horizon very briefly on anti-Semitism and talk about Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and then also talk about Israel very briefly. Let me use France as an example in Western Europe, but we can also speak about Germany and the like. There is what we call in France anti-Semitism in France and anti-Semitism of France. Let me repeat that because it's a subtle difference. There is anti-Semitism in France and anti-Semitism of France. A large segment of the French population, in excess of 10%, lives in France but has not yet assimilated its values. And consequently, it is in France but not of France. If you are an ordinary Frenchman who has assimilated the values of equality, fraternity, and equality, liberty, and fraternity, then you understand that Jews and Muslims, Catholics, and secularists are all part of the same society and you work well together. The community of immigrants, the Muslim immigrants, have been living in France but not assimilating to the values of France, and consequently, they have not become part and parcel of the society, and they were responding to elements in the Middle East. And the increase of anti-Semitism in France was an increase precisely correlated with how events in the Middle East were unstable. If you had the terrorism attacks of 2001 in Israel, you had the terrorism attacks in France itself. If you had the war in Lebanon, you had an increase in anti-Semitism. The war in Gaza, an increase in anti-Semitism. And essentially, even French criticism of Israel was regarded as license to attack the Jews next door. And the Jews who were victimized were often the least affluent of French society and the least protected. What's the good news about France, which is also the good news of Europe? A tremendous transformation from a generation ago. The good news is that the leadership of these countries has determined that anti-Semitism is against the interests of their own society. So in the aftermath of Hyper Cacher and Charlie Hebdo, the French president said what? He said, France without its Jews is not France. And the French president and the German chancellor marched down the street together against anti-Semitism. When there was an attack on the synagogue in Germany, in Halle, what happened immediately is that the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, stood outside the synagogue in Berlin at the end of Yom Kippur services to demonstrate solidarity with the Jewish community. And again, that should not happen in Germany, must not happen in Germany. What's the problem? The problem is that there is a radical right Nazi movement that has come out of the closet in Germany, which is not only threatening the center of Germany, but also threatening the Jews and the immigrants, and working again to promote anti-Semitism in the same way that you have a radical right and a radical left movement in France that's working against it. In Eastern Europe, you have the demise of the love of democracy taking place, and what's substituting for that is nationalism. And what's remarkable in Eastern Europe is that it's happening at a time in which Eastern Europe has never been more prosperous. I go to Poland very often on work. Poland has never been as prosperous as it is today. And what are the nationalists trying to do? They're trying to rewrite the past in order to legitimate the Poles and to blame everything that happened in Poland on the Germans. In the exception to this, ironically, is Russia. And the reason for that is that the prime minister, the president of Russia, Putin, has warm memories of his Jewish neighbors. And even if he's not good to Israel, he is very good to the Jews of Russia. And he's holding back what our ancestors would have called Russian anti-Semitism, because he will not tolerate it at all. And he has an authoritarian type of leadership that makes it unacceptable. In the Middle East, there is a bit of very good news which has taken place. And the very good news in the Middle East is that the Israelis are now in a strategic alliance with the Sunni Muslims against Shiites. And the Sunnis will more trust Israel with a nuclear bomb than they will trust the Shiites and Iran with a nuclear bomb. And that strategic alliance has been transformed over the last 2 years into a de facto recognition and a de jure recognition of Israel. And that's going to change the textbooks in a whole range of Sunni countries vis-a-vis Israel. And it's very interesting because it is a piece of leadership that will eventually transform itself and move to the population in general. And consequently, we can say that there will be a significant diminishment of anti-Semitism in one segment of the Muslim population. Let me present to you one thing that you'll have to understand. Israel, which for the older generation was the guarantee against anti-Semitism, has become a lightning rod for anti-Semitism today. What are the three elements we have to pay attention to? What differentiates Israeli anti-Semitism or anti-Semitism from legitimate criticism of Israel? The best formula for that is what we call the 3D formula. If you judge Israel, double standards. If you judge Israel by one standard, everybody else by another standard, you're moving toward anti-Semitism. Delegitimation. If you say that Israel exists on land that it took from native populations, then that's a legitimate statement. But that's also true of the United States. It's also true of Canada. It's also true of Australia. And it's true of many countries of South America. If you say that they have a right to exist, then Israel has a right to exist. And finally, the third element that is different from, that is surely a manifestation of anti-Semitism, is when you regard Israel as demonic, as the source of all evil. And that's the danger of Israel as a trigger for anti-Semitism. And the Israelis themselves these days are not helping their own situation by having a whole range of issues within society. And Israel itself is suffering from a crisis of leadership and a crisis of polarization. Israel, we all know, has had 4 elections in 2 years with the same non-result. And Israel has now been called by the president of Israel, the tribes of Israel, not the nation of Israel. You have an ultra-Orthodox community, you have a modern Orthodox community, you have a Zionist nationalist community, you have a radical Arab community, you have a mainstream Arab community, you have a secularist community, all of them living within Israel, none of them able to work easily with each other to achieve a national consensus. So certainly we live at a time in which, and the danger to Israel, as far as I'm concerned, right now, is a unique danger, which is it's internal more than external. Because on a deep level, Israel has never been more physically secure or economically prosperous than it is today. And it's achieved 2 great things that never before achieved. Number one, with desalinization, it has water. And with the discovery of new sources of energy, it has energy for the first time. And it's going to be a net exporter of energy. And those of you who are old enough to remember 73, when we thought, oh my God, Moses took the wrong turn. Had he only gone to Saudi Arabia, Israel would have been protected. Israel now off the coast has discovered sources of gas that will, and sources of oil. And the other element to pay attention to is no nation has ever attacked another nation which was the source of its water. Because the one non-negotiable in every situation is water. And Israel on that not only does desalinization, but I say in California, Israel reuses 87% of its water. California recycles 17% of its water. So out in California, at least, you guys have
Dr. Berenbaum, you've become muted, so you need to unmute yourself.
very few people have ever accused me of being muted, Rabbi. Let me conclude. What do we need to do with regard to anti-Semitism in the United States in particular? I'd suggest 4 things. Number one, we need to recognize the problem and seek allies. And that is that the allies now are all across the board because there are multiple targets of anti-Semitism. Asian Americans now feel ill at ease. African Americans feel put upon. Hispanic Americans, ironically, the Spanish community, the Hispanic community in the United States has very little relationship to Jews, and that's tremendous opportunity. The Asian American community has a tremendous intellectual alliance and commercial alliance with the Jews, and that's also an opportunity. We need alliances. Number 2, we have to work very, very hard for social stability in our society, because the more unstable our society remains, the greater the fertility for anti-Semitism within our society. If we don't have stability in our society, if we don't have opportunity in our society, then we're going to be in trouble. Number 3, the Jewish community cannot be at war with itself. We can accomplish an awful lot together, and we should be deep and profound advocates of a word that has become lost in our society over the many years of polarization, which is the overriding interest in the common good. And finally, we have to work against every form of hatred imaginable and go back to the most fundamental thing that we get to. Number one, that all human beings are created in the image of God, entitled to respect and decency. And number two, we are all Americans, no matter what the adjectives around the title America. African Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, white Americans, etc., etc. The danger that we face let me conclude with this as well. We are a victim, in one sense, of our success. Until white supremacy became so widespread as an articulated form, the Jews were regarded as a privileged part of the white majority. We had lived and earned like Episcopalians, even if our voting patterns did not reflect that. We now are regarded by segments of American society as conditionally white, and our own success, because we were regarded as successful, meant that people did not disqualify anti-Semites from participating in their causes. Last point, finally, is if I had one wish for the Jewish people today, for the younger generation, for my students and my children, and even for theirs, it is that there was a great statement many years ago by a fellow by the name of Kurt Flood, who was the man who broke the reserve clause in baseball. Rabbi Klein was kind enough to talk about my love of baseball. He broke the reserve clause, and he once was asked a question, and he said, "I never regretted having a black skin. I just wish I had a thicker skin." Jews need a thick skin now. And the thick skin is we need to be able to be tough, we need to be able to be prideful, and we need to be able to be strong. And when I lecture to younger people, I say something: the worst thing you can do with anti-Semitism is to internalize the critique and feel less proud of your own self and of your own tradition. We come out of a great tradition. We have made a monumental contribution to humanity, and we have to be tough and strong in our own sense of pride, so we don't internalize the venom that we have in our society that's being directed against all of us. Let's take some questions in the chat. We have a little bit of time for that.
Dr. Berenbaum, thank you so much. Wonderful insights and powerful messages for us. If people would like to ask a question, I'll moderate the questions. Please send them to me as the host in your chat box, and I will relay them to everyone. The first question comes to us and says, what can be done on our college campuses?
That's a very good question. Number one, Jewish young people are found on college campuses. And the first thing that has to be done on the college campus is we have to prepare our kids to go on college campuses. Prepare the kids to go on college campuses by understanding some of the very important issues that take place on college campuses, and be prepared, for example, to understand Israel, and be prepared also to understand the divides reflected in society. Let me tell you an interesting story, which is that my son, University of Michigan, which has a significant Jewish community and a very active Jewish community, was a place in which BDS came up for a vote. Came up for a vote for 4 years in a row. It failed 4 years. The fifth year, the sources of BDS organized and in a very real way got into the leadership of the student community. My son's best friend on campus led the anti-BDS thing. And the kids were up till 4:30 in the morning fighting the issue. And I kept getting calls all night. How do you respond to this? How do you respond to that? How do you respond to the other thing? And the most interesting point for me was that you had a whole range of kids not prepared to respond to some of the issues that were thrown. We also had a terrible situation at USC, and this is what I mean by toughness. And I'm going to give two specific examples about it. The the vice president of USC who became president, was singled out because she had been to Israel and she therefore must have been a Zionist, and they put pressure on her to resign. You know what happened? She resigned. And I said at that moment, that's precisely the moment where you don't resign. You don't leave power. You don't leave office. You have the strength and the ability to take it. We had the same thing with Barry Weiss, who had written a fine book on anti-Semitism, ends up resigning from the editorial board of the New York Times because she couldn't take some of the comments that were being made. We need to develop a toughness about it. And we also need to understand that there has to be academic leadership on the part of those professors who are not anti-Israel. And I see that on the college campuses all along. And pride, I'll give you one simple example. I have become a professor at Haifa University, so that when they introduce me on college campuses, I proudly say I'm at Haifa University as well. If you want to BDS me, come BDS me, but let's grapple with that as well. College campuses are the place where Jewish youngsters will be living and getting an education. We have to prepare them for that. We have to support them for that. And I think it's a winnable battle, and I think it's being won, though it's taking time.
Great, thank you. When you talk about seeking allies, some people think that evangelicals are good allies to the Jews, and others say that yes, they are lovers of Israel, but come to loggerheads with us on many other Jewish issues. And where do you stand on those relationships and that conversation?
Well, Rabbi, you know the story about one person comes to Rabbi, asks a question, he listens to them, and he says, "You're right." The other person comes to and says, "You're right." And the wife or the student says, "How can both of them be right?" And he says, "You're right too." So the answer is that the evangelicals are allies with the government of Israel. If Israel develops, and the reason they're allies is an interesting reason, because they say they see the resettlement of Jews in the ancient homeland as a prelude to the coming of Jesus as Christ once again into the world. I can guarantee two things that I know as a matter of faith. Number one, there's an old story about the old Jew who's had a job to stand at the gates of the shtetl and to wait for the Messiah. And they asked him a wonderful question, "What's with the job?" He says, "The pay is poor, but the work is steady." So the one thing I believe in with an absolute certitude is the Messiah has not yet come. And you want the truth of that, take a look at any newspaper, breathe the air, look at the society we live in, and we know we're not yet redeemed. I don't believe that Christ is coming back, not in my lifetime, nor in the lifetimes I can conceive of. Consequently, there's a danger that we may ultimately be blamed for that. Those of us who see a little bit of a different perspective hope that if Israel has the opportunity for trading land for peace, and I don't see it on the horizon, but if they had the opportunity, that the evangelicals will not blame us for not doing that. And frankly, we are at odds with the evangelical on a whole range of issues, including but certainly not limited to abortion, but including issues about the role of government, including issues about the nature of compassion within society and the role of social justice. And we have to be frank and understanding of that. The government of Israel has struck an alliance with the evangelicals sometimes even in opposition to the Jewish community, and we have to be mindful of that as well. So yes, I welcome the support of the evangelicals, but no, I will not pay for that support by what? By muting the issues of social justice that are heavily involved in the issues that I care about the most.
Thank you. The next question. What do you think the current U.S. administration could do to effectively reverse or challenge the growth of white supremacy?
I think the administration is trying to do a lot to do that. The first is, I think that the administration has ended the sense of multiple crises. Everything became a crisis. Let's give you an example of language. I was deeply disturbed in 2018 when they referred to the caravans coming to a border as an invasion. An invasion you respond to one way and you get frightened of an invasion. If you say we have a problem at the border that has to be dealt with, number one, by dealing with it in Latin and South America, you're already doing some preventive elements. By dealing it with a compassionate home, you're dealing with it as well. You have to change the tone of what we do. You have to resolve certain issues. So if we resolve the health crisis and the economic crisis, we've already achieved something quite significant in that. The language that we use must not be a language of animus, but a language of inclusiveness. And I always go back to a very basic thing when I lecture on the Adolf Hitler. First of all, there are no comparisons to Hitler, but understand this, that Adolf Hitler and Franklin Delano Roosevelt came to power 32 days away from each other. 4th of March, 33 days away from each other. The 4th of March and the 30th of January. Hitler turned the nation one against the other, and Roosevelt turned the nation one toward the other. And the degree to which we turn toward the other, is the degree to which we achieve a certain measure of unity and a certain measure of solidarity. And we lost a tremendous opportunity with the health crisis. My wearing a mask protects not only me, but it protects you. My getting a vaccine not only protects me, but it protects you. And the idea that we are all in this together becomes one of the very important pieces of language that takes place. And we have a venom in our society. And the venom in our society is the venom of people who are polarized and don't talk to the other. And part of what we have to do is to move on that. So I am pleased with the change of tone. I am worried about elements from the extreme right, and I'm worried also about elements from the extreme left in American society. I am a passionate centrist.
Thank you, and I think we're going to have maybe one or two more questions, and then we'll wrap up.
Robbie, let me make a suggestion. Why don't you ask both questions, and I'll give one answer.
Okay. So the first question is fundamentally, why is it that the Jewish community has been the recipient or target throughout history of so much hatred, so many persecutions, and continues in that vein, even today in our modern time and in our North American experience?
Okay, and ask the second question as well.
And the second one is, whatever happened to the strong, sort of never again pushback against anti-Semites?
Okay, I'm going to share one element of the screen that I want you to look at for a moment. And I want you to look at this in a very particular way. Anti-Semitism varies according to the source. And I want you, every time you listen to anti-Semitism, ask what the source is. Is it racial? Is it religious? Is it nationalist? Is it economic? Is it political? Is it social? Anti-Semitism varies according to the level of preoccupation. One of the things that protected American Jews for centuries is we were not the first of America's enemies. We weren't target number one. Even at the height of anti-Semitism, we were target number 3 or number 4. It varies by how endangered a society feels. And it varies how important anti-Semitism is to the anti-Semite. Is it their first, second, third, or fourth priority? And anti-Semitism varies according to what its goal is. Christianity, the goal was conversion. By the way, something that stopped with the Roman Catholic Church in our decade. When we weren't admitted to clubs, and we all know the Groucho Marx line, I would never want to become a member of a club that would have me as a member. The idea was exclusion. We don't want Jews from here. In Spain, in England, in a whole range of countries, the goal was expulsion. And in Nazi Germany, the goal was annihilation. I don't use the word extermination. So what happened to the notion of never again? Let me talk about that for a moment, because we have a very interesting thing, which is that those people that took never again seriously did something very serious about it. Best example of that, I'll give you 2, is the Roman Catholic Church. Let's take a look at the last half century of Catholic Church-Jewish relations. St. John the 23rd eliminated the accusation that Jews are Christ killers. Christ died for our sins, then essentially sin is the cause of the crucifixion of Christ. John Paul II did 2 things that were absolutely incredible. He made a speech in which he said anti-Semitism is anti-Christian. The second thing is he recognized what happened to the Jews after 1948, which is relationships with Israel. And Francis ended the notion of the mission to the Jews because he said Jews are fine with their covenant. We are a legitimate religion, and John Paul II prayed at the Western Wall. For Christianity, the symbol of the Western Wall was that God had abandoned the Jews. And John Paul prayed there, and he apologized for the anti-Semitism of Christians. And he was a man of the theater. Christianity took that seriously, and Germany created itself up till now as the anti-Nazi. So what's been the result? It paid reparations to survivors as the price for joining the family of nations. It is the largest growing Jewish community in Europe because it welcomed the Jews. And the Berlin community, you can go along in Berlin on your Hebrew. If only American Jews spoke Hebrew well, because the Israeli community there is very strong. And it also established relations and support with Israel, and the leaders of Germany are leading the fight for anti-Semitism and leading the fight for Holocaust denial. So the people who took never, and what did we do as Jews? We took never again seriously. And because we took never again seriously, we stood in solidarity with Israel in 67 and 73 when Israel was at risk. Because we took never again, we saved Soviet Jewry, so we weren't going to allow ourselves to be destroyed. And we saved an entire generation of Jews who were able to move from oppression to freedom. And because we took never again seriously, we saved Ethiopian Jews. The first time in history that blacks were taken somewhere for freedom instead of enslavement. So I think, and never again also gave us a quarter of a century or maybe even 45 years of the idea that people were not going to, even people who were anti-Semitic, were not going to express their anti-Semitism. Now we are at a distance, and the paradox of the Holocaust is a very peculiar paradox, which is that the innocent feel guilty and the guilty feel innocent. And sometimes the innocent feel responsible. We have a vast literature of survivor guilt and survivors who are innocent. We have a slight literature of perpetrator guilt, and perpetrators feel what? Innocent. And Germany is an example of where the third generation of Germans is not guilty, but it feels responsible. And I'll tell you a story. I was invited to speak at a Mexican university, and I see I'm on the panel with a woman whose last name is Himmler. And I scratched myself and I say, one of my very few assets in life is my reputation. And why the hell would I want to appear on a panel with a woman by the name of Himmler, who was a grandniece of Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust? So I read her work. And her work was a study of her family, which indicted her family for what they did, including the grandmother that she loved, who ended up being an ardent supporter of the Nazis and essential to the rat line. And I found that I had more in common with a Himmler who had felt responsible for what her parents and grandparents and parents had done, but who was thoroughly innocent herself, than I had with most other people in the world. So we never again had a very important meeting, and never again also meant, for example, that we stood. Look, I was in Rwanda during that, right after that genocide, and the people who were in Rwanda in order to help in the aftermath of the genocide, I had yurtsite then, and I got a minion. Rwanda, Africa. And I found what? Jewish doctors and Jewish nurses, Jewish economic people, and then a couple of historians like me who were trying to teach the Rwandese how to document their genocide. So we've been there because we take never again, not only for Jews, but never again for the world community. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Berenbaum. I realize that tonight we asked a great deal of you. And as I was thinking about it, you have helped us to fulfill two mitzvot, Shamor and Zachor. Because this is an evening of Zachor, but as you made such a powerful case, and as we all know, it is a day in which Shamor is important, paying heed and focusing on what must be done as Jews right here and now in the world in which we live. So thank you for both, Shamor v'Zachor, and for an evening that we will long remember. And I thank my colleagues, I thank all of you for joining us on this powerful evening, and may we never forget. And to that we say Erev Tov.